record button.
Okay.
Yeah, we're recording.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. So as Heidi said, I worked with penguins at the New England Aquarium, and I was there for, let me see, 9 years. And then I left there about 12 years ago and started my educational company called The Penguin Lady. And so now I travel locally and internationally. I lecture to kids and adults all around the world about penguin biology, behavior, and conservation. And I donate 20% of my proceeds to penguin rescue, research, and conservation groups, because my mission as a Penguin Lady is to raise awareness and funding to protect penguins. So this morning, why I am here is to speak with you about, hang on, my slides aren't forwarding, about penguins and climate change. And can penguins survive our warming planet? So as Heidi mentioned, we met on Homeward Bound, this epic 3-week adventure in Antarctica with 75 other incredible women in science from all around the world. And when we were there, of course, we saw a lot of penguins. This was one of my favorite stops on Deception Island among a colony of about 250,000 chinstrap penguins. So I'm going to maybe break a few myths here just briefly about penguins. Penguins are not all found in cold places. Most penguins are not found in Antarctica, even though there are a large number of them there. There's only 4 species that live and breed there. So penguins are found only in the southern hemisphere. So all these locations where you see these green stars are where you'll find penguins. So as far north as the equator, where the Galapagos penguin lives, down to Antarctica, and then a lot of subantarctic islands in between in the southern oceans, and the southern tips of the continents in the southern hemisphere. So they don't all live in cold places. Most penguins actually are more temperate. So they live in climates actually similar to our climate here on the latitude that we're at, because you and I are in similar latitudes. So there are 18 penguin species. 15 or 13 now of those 18 are listed as threatened, near threatened, or endangered. And so there's a number of various threats that I'll discuss in just a moment that are impacting these penguin populations. And when I spoke with Heidi yesterday or the other day, she was saying that you talked about the R and K selected species, and penguins are a K selected species. So they have a long life, they have few offspring, they are territorial, and they need a stable environment for their survival, essentially. And penguins are an indicator species. So indicator species, if you haven't discussed that yet, are species that they're basically the canaries in the coal mine. So if we see the population of an indicator species crashing, as we are seeing with almost all penguin species now, that's an indication to us that there's a problem in their ecosystem. So it's like the penguins are out there waving this red flag, you know, saying, hey, look, there's a problem with our oceans. And so this infograph just shows you one particular penguin species, the African penguin, which are found in South Africa and Namibia. Their population has declined by 99% in the last 100 years. And that's a pretty startling statistic. And we're seeing crashes like this among most of the penguin populations today. And that's very, very alarming. So the various reasons, the various threats to penguins, very briefly, are the following. So we have introduced predators, and that does include, in fact, pets like cats and dogs. And these are predators that didn't naturally belong in this place, so the penguins don't have any natural defenses against them. Encroachment of their territory. I took this picture last year down in Cape Town at Boulders Beach, and there's a penguin breeding colony there on the beach, but you can see in the background all these homes. So homes and hotels are being built in their territory. In New Zealand, all the trees are being cut down, which is very important breeding habitat for the yellow-eyed penguin, which is highly endangered now. So this is a threat. Plastics pollution and other pollution, not only getting entangled in plastics, but now ingestion of plastics, and entanglement in fishing nets. And this is both on the artisanal or local level, as well as the commercial level. And then the top 2 threats to penguins today are overfishing of their food source. And I think this image is pretty remarkable. You see this, commercial fishing net, and then just to the right in this photo, you see a Gentoo penguin. So, not only is this boat scooping up its food, but he nearly got trapped in that fishing net himself. So that's a pretty lucky penguin right there. And the UN has reported that 90% of our ocean's fish are now fully or overfished. And there have been reports saying that by 2048, we may have completely fished our oceans out of edible seafood, edible meaning edible for human consumption. So the number one threat is climate change or global warming. And this is impacting different penguin populations or different species in different ways, but it is impacting nearly all penguin species now. And this cartoon, which is saying, we'll probably have to do more to adapt to climate change. It's difficult to do because penguins are pretty bound to their breeding territory in particular. And so when they come to shore to breed and raise their chicks, they have to have a food source that they can reach by swimming on a daily basis or every couple days in order to get back to their territory, to their nesting grounds to feed those chicks. And what we're seeing now is that's getting harder and harder for a lot of penguins to do. And so a lot of penguins are starving. We are seeing some adaptations on the Antarctic Peninsula, which I will talk about in just a second. So ocean currents. So there are these cold ocean currents in the southern hemisphere, in both hemispheres, but in the southern hemisphere, this is where you will find the penguins, is along these cold ocean currents. And that is because those cold waters are more nutrient rich, and because they're more nutrient rich, they carry more of the penguin's prey, fish, krill, and squid. So they're very dependent upon these cold water currents and those currents staying near their breeding and foraging grounds. And I don't know if you've spoken much about El Niño yet, but what happens in an El Niño year is there's a warming on the surface temperatures of the ocean. And also what happens is the cold water currents, and these currents that these penguins are dependent on, get pushed further deep, they get further down and away from their breeding grounds. So if you look at this map on the bottom, or the image on the bottom, you can see along the coast of South America where these warm waters are right in the Galapagos Islands on the equator, and the Humboldt penguins as well live in Peru and near this area. And so they're very impacted by El Niños. And as you may know, El Niños are becoming more frequent and more severe. And so the Galapagos penguin in particular has been really highly impacted by climate change and by El Niño events. There were two very strong El Niños, I think it was 83 and 93, in which 70% of the adult Galapagos penguins died due to starvation. And there have been many breeding seasons for this particular species where they had total breeding failure. Either they didn't even try to breed because they just didn't have the resources to feed themselves and feed chicks, or the chicks starved. So this is one species that's very impacted by El Niño in particular. And so the International Penguin Conference is a conference of all penguin researchers, field researchers, zoo and aquarium professionals. It happens every 3 years in a different city around the world. And I've been going to this conference since the year 2000, where I presented a poster. And it's been very interesting to watch the transition in what the researchers are focusing on in those 17 years. Because 17 years ago, they were talking about all different topics to do with penguins, the breeding, foraging, ecology, the lifespan, all sorts of topics. At the last IPC, last September in Cape Town, nearly all of the research was focused on foraging ecology, on the food source, on why are they starving, and on climate change. And so clearly, it's something that scientists are very, very concerned about. They can't draw a direct line from climate change and overfishing to penguin starving, but it's they're pretty sure this is the reason why all these penguins are starving, because that's the main thing that is killing penguins now throughout the southern hemisphere is starvation. So I'm just going to focus the rest of this on Antarctica, where we were last year, and on the Antarctic Peninsula. If you look at this map on the left here, this red section is the Antarctic Peninsula, and it is one of the fastest warming places on the planet. As you may know, the poles are the fastest warming. And we've seen a huge increase in the temperature on the Antarctic Peninsula over the last 25 years or so. About, I think it's a 9-degree Fahrenheit increase, which is pretty frightening. It's pretty phenomenal. So the 4 penguin species that do live and breed in Antarctica are the gentoo penguin, the chinstrap penguin, the Adelie penguin, and these 3 are actually breeding primarily on the peninsula. They also breed in other locations, but those are the main colonies you see on the peninsula of Antarctica. And then the 4th species that does breed in Antarctica, but not on the peninsula, is the emperor penguin. And this is that iconic species in March of the Penguins and so many cartoons that you see. There is 1 breeding colony on the peninsula at Snow Island, just a small colony, about 400 penguins. But these are the 4 species that are in Antarctica. So again, back to this map, what we're seeing on the peninsula is a shift south on the peninsula of some of these breeding colonies. So in particular, the gentoo penguins, that first picture I showed you with the 2 chicks, they're seeing now some of those colonies, they're moving their colonies further south on the peninsula because it's colder. The further south you go in the peninsula, the colder it gets as you're getting towards the interior of the continent. And so they're seeing a shift as the climate is warming, the penguins are moving further south to try and stay in colder temperatures. Now, with global warming, what happens is there's more moisture in the air, there's an increased precipitation in both the form of snow and rain. And so even though Antarctica is technically a desert, it is one of the driest places on Earth, which is sort of counterintuitive. It seems like there's a ton of snow there, but most of the snow there is snow that has been there for centuries. Now with global warming, they're seeing big snowstorms, you know, like blizzards. And when they have a blizzard like this with tons of snow, the penguins, if they are breeding, and that's the only reason they're there is to breed or to molt, which is replacing their feathers every year, their instinct to protect that nest and stay on that egg or that chick is so strong, they won't abandon the nest and they will literally get buried under the snow and they can be buried and smothered. Now, when those deep snows melt or when it rains, again, if they have eggs or chicks, those eggs or chicks can drown. And so if you look at the photo on the right here, those little red circles are eggs underneath the water, which clearly are not going to hatch and produce any chicks. And this photo I took on my first trip to Antarctica in 2009. And this was at Port Lockroy, which Heidi and I were at. It was our last stop on this trip as well. And this was a very sort of unsettling day because the day that we were there, it was raining. And, you know, you don't go to Antarctica and expect to see rain. And they didn't see rain there on the peninsula until about 25 years ago. And the penguins just aren't adapted for this because these little chicks don't yet have waterproof feathers. They're covered with a very soft, fluffy down. And so that water soaks through down to their skin. And these chicks are too large to fit under their parents, although they're trying to jam themselves under there. And so they can get frozen. And these chicks this day, all the penguin chicks that we saw were just huddled under their parents and they were shivering violently trying to stay warm. So it was a rather disturbing image on the last day in Antarctica on that trip. And so this cartoon is saying, back when I was your age, my folks had to walk for days before reaching open water to find food. So for the emperor penguin, they breed on these ice shelves that form during the Antarctic winter. And those ice shelves are melting back towards the breeding colony as the season progresses. Now, what they're seeing in the last several years now is that when the ice melts back to that colony, some of those chicks have not yet fledged into their waterproof feathers. So these are emperor penguin chicks. They're mostly fledged, partly fledged. You know, the ones that have that gray fluffy down, they're not ready to go in the water yet. The ones that have mostly the white chests, they may survive. But they're now seeing some of these penguin chicks that they're not ready, they're not fledged. And so when that ice melts back, they get into that water, they freeze, they get waterlogged, they can drown. And so every year there's an increase and a decrease in the sea ice that's formed. This is a natural part of the process that occurs. And last year they're seeing an increase in the sea ice on the west coast of the peninsula, but a decrease on the east coast, which is where we were and where a lot of these breeding colonies are. And overall, though, there's been a decrease in the amount of sea ice. And this impacts their food source. One of their primary food sources is krill. And how it impacts their breeding, the krill's breeding, is that the krill, their larva, which is what you see on the right, they feed on the algae that grows underneath the surface of this ice shelf. And so when there's less ice, there's less food, less algae for the larva, and so then there's less krill. So between overfishing of the krill in Antarctica and less sea ice for these krill nurseries, there's less krill for the penguins to eat. And this is the primary food source for most of the penguins that live in Antarctica. And this image, I don't know if you can see the little pink stuff in between there that the parent is feeding to the chick is the krill. So we did stop at Palmer Station and speak with the researchers there, and they showed us this image of glacial retreat of the glacier there, and it's retreated quite a bit over the last 30, 40 years. And there is a breeding colony of Adelie penguins there, and about 30 years ago, there were 9,000 Adelie penguins, and now there's only a little over 1,000 Adelie penguins there. And they thought that those Adelie penguins, what they thought that colony had also moved further south on the peninsula like the Gentoo penguins were doing. But they just discovered this year that that's not the case. They're just disappearing. And they don't know where they're disappearing to. They don't know if they've starved, if they've gone to some other place that, you know, they haven't found them yet, but they are disappearing, which again is alarming. And you may have heard about this story just a couple weeks ago. This was not at Palmer Station. It was at another Adelie penguin colony in Antarctica on the peninsula, in which only 2 chicks survived from a colony of 40,000 adult Adelie penguins. It was a total breeding collapse, total breeding failure. And the main reason was they starved. And a lot of eggs didn't even hatch because the parents probably abandoned them because they didn't have the resources to feed the chicks. And what was a little disturbing, again, is that this is the second time in 5 years that this colony had a total breeding collapse. So the future for penguins is a little tenuous. We really have to do our part to do whatever we can to reduce our impact on the planet. Heidi, I think, is going to, at another time, talk to you about that. So I'm not going to talk about those solutions right now. But what I am going to just briefly tell you about is a project, a citizen science project, that you actually can participate in. And it's a very cool project called Penguin Watch. And the citizen science project is a project where everyday citizens can help researchers collect or count their data. And so with this project, what it is, you can go to this website called penguinwatch.org, and they have taken about 6 million photographs of penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula, and you help them count those images, the penguins in those images. And so they have cameras set up along the Antarctic Peninsula in a lot of different locations. And this was just a couple images of when we were there, some of these cameras that we saw. I saw, I think, about 6 in different locations that we were at. And these are constantly taking images. And so you go onto penguinwatch.org and you can click on these images. So you would take your mouse and you click on adult up here, and then you just put your mouse on the center of each of the adults and click on it, and it counts them. And then you click on chicks, which is in green. Again, take your mouse and click on each chick, and then finish marking, and you submit your counted picture. And several people are counting each picture, so they're getting good data. And then some images, as you can see, are much easier to count than others. 1 penguin, piece of cake. And then there's an FAQ section with boards, so you can ask questions and talk with other participants. And so it's just a very cool thing that you can do to help the researchers find out what's happening in Antarctica with the penguins, how is climate change impacting their populations, and you can be a citizen scientist. So that is, I think, all I have for you this morning, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you might have. I know that was a really quick overview of climate change and penguins, but I hope you learned a couple of cool things this morning.
Thank you, Dyan.
You're welcome.
Questions?
So when we said there was a 7% collapse in population in 83 and 93, in between those 2 collapses, was there population rebound? So was it like compounding 70 on 70, or was it like 70% done, they rebound like 30 to 40% and then another 70? Or was it like-
Good question. That population on the Galapagos Islands really did not rebound. A little bit, there was a little bit of a rebound, but no. So that population today is highly, highly endangered. There are only about 1,500 Galapagos penguins left in the wild, which is an alarmingly small number. So yeah, if you want to see Galapagos penguins in the wild, you should go soon to see them.
Other questions? Doesn't look like it. Diane, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
You're welcome.
And like I said, I recorded it and I will